Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Danielle Yao, and it's my pleasure to announce and introduce the start of today's webinar on looking ahead to CBD COP15, opportunities and challenges posed by other effective area-based conservation measures organized by the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas and the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law in partnership with the Asia-Pacific Center for Environmental Law and the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. What is this event today about? Well, at the 14th meeting of the Conference of Parties to the CBD in 2018, parties adopted Decision 14/8 on the OECMs, containing the scientific and technical advice for OECMs. These are expected to complement the practical protected areas across landscapes and seascapes, and to enable to improve recognition and support for areas that are effectively and equitably managed, as well as to achieve the long-term in situ conservation of biodiversities. This then raises the question for parties. How do we advance the discussion about the legal and regulatory framework for OECMs to ensure that they may deliver the outcomes required by CBD parties, assuming, of course, as is expected, that the CBD parties will consider these in addition to protected areas to achieve this target at CBD COP15 in Kunming next year. Before we begin, I would just like to bring your attention to some housekeeping matters. Please, for example, feel free to leave questions using the Q&A function. Please do remember to mute your mics as well as to shut off your cameras for the duration of this discussion and to complete the evaluation forms. Now, please allow me to welcome our two opening speakers for the opening remarks, Dr. Madhurao, the chair of the AUCN WCPA, and Professor Christina Voigt, the chair of the AUCN WCEL, to deliver the opening address. Some brief remarks. Dr. Madhurao chairs, as I said, of the AUCN World Commission on Protected Areas and also the senior policy advisor at the Wildlife Conservation Society. As a conservation scientist, she has over 25 years of experience in designing and supporting the implementation of conservation field programs across Asia and ASEAN. She is also currently an adjunct associate professor at the National University of Singapore, where she co-leads the development of a new master's program on biodiversity conservation and nature-based climate solutions. Our other opening remarks will be delivered by Professor Christina Voigt, who is the professor of law at the University of Oslo, Norway, and an internationally renowned expert in international environmental law. She has worked as principal legal advisor for the government of Norway previously and is currently the chair of the AUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. It is a great privilege for us to have these two speakers, and I will invite the participants to read their full bio, which is available at the links. Dr. Madhurao, may I now hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Danielle. I'm very honored to welcome all panelists and participants to this webinar that is jointly organized by two IUCN commissions, the World Commission on Protected Areas and the World Commission on Environmental Law, in close partnership with APSEL and the Center for International Law in Singapore. It is now widely established and accepted that biodiversity is in crisis. The IPBES reports confirm that 75% of the Earth's land surface is significantly altered, with up to 66% of the ocean area experiencing increasing and cumulative human impacts. Currently, both the extent and integrity of most natural ecosystems are in decline, and these trends are expected to continue under business as usual scenarios. The three most significant direct drivers of biodiversity loss are land and sea use change, direct exploitation, and climate change. Importantly, there is consistent scientific agreement that very large-scale conservation is required to deal with these known drivers of biodiversity loss. As governments negotiate the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, there is strong and growing global support for effectively protecting at least 30% of the Earth's land, sea, and freshwater ecosystems by 2030. This is viewed as a key requirement for halting and beginning to reverse biodiversity loss, as well as contributing to addressing the climate crisis. The 30% target represents a near doubling of the area under conservation at the current time. Not only must we strengthen effectiveness of existing protected area systems, we will also need to significantly expand the spatial extent of area that is governed and managed for effective biodiversity outcomes. This is where OECMs become relevant as a conservation designation for areas that are achieving the effective in situ conservation of biodiversity outside of protected areas. From 2015 to 2018, IUCN provided technical advice to parties on OECMs to the CBD through a WCPA task force on OECMs. In 2018, parties to the CBD through CBD Decision 14/8 agreed guiding principles, common characteristics, and criteria for the identification of OECMs. OECMs, together with protected areas, offer new opportunities for area-based conservation. We have a new tool in the toolbox, and we need to understand and learn how we can apply this tool effectively to achieve biodiversity conservation and global biodiversity targets. We have an excellent panel of distinguished speakers today to generate knowledge sharing and discussion on how OECMs are being recognized at the national level. What are the existing legal and regulatory frameworks that enable the recognition of OECMs? What are the associated challenges and how might they be addressed to enable the long-term conservation of biodiversity within OECMs and ultimately towards successful implementation of the global biodiversity framework? With this, I hand over to Dr. Christina Voigt, Chair of the World Commission on Environmental Law.
Thank you so much, Dr. Madhurao, and thank you, Danielle, for your kind words of introduction. It is, of course, also my great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law to this seminar today on looking forward to COP 2015, Opportunities and Challenges, posed by other effective area-based management measures, or OECMs, as we will call them throughout this seminar. Before I start, I just want to say it's a great joy and it's a privilege working together with the World Commission on Protected Areas and its chair, Dr. Madhurao. As you perhaps know, the IUCN works primarily through its 6 expert commissions, which are volunteer networks of 10,000 of experts worldwide, and they give input to the IUCN members, which are both states, but also non-governmental organizations. At this moment, I would also like to thank very much the National University of Singapore and its Center on International Law and its director, Dr. Nilofer Oral, as well as the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law and its director, Dr. Jolene Lin, for the excellent support and cooperation in preparing the seminar. And also both directors are willing to give some comments a little bit later throughout the seminar today. Thanks also to Alicia and to Emily Gaskin, the Executive Officer of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. Let me say some words about the role of the World Commission on Environmental Law in this seminar, or the role of law in general. As Dr. Rao just mentioned, we expect, hopefully, that a global target of conserving at least 30% of land and sea areas by 2030 will be included and adopted in the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which is currently in target 3 of the current draft for this framework. These are areas that are to be conserved through both protected areas and OECMs in a way that is effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative, and a well-connected system of areas. It's supposed to be long-term and measurable. And in this respect, several legal issues arise, which we will seek to discuss today. And I'll just mention a couple of them very briefly. The first question is, what role does law play in recognizing or designing OECMs? And the relatively easy answer to that is, well, the role of law is indispensable, because arguably no protected area for sure, but also no OECM would exist without some sort of legal recognition or regulation to establish or to identify them. And the second question, how to identify OECMs or design them, ex post or ex ante, that's another question. But here we are looking at the very interesting interplay between science and the law. And that's why it's so interesting to have both commissions of the IUCN working together on this aspect. When it comes to science, of course, we know that OECMs have to be a particular importance for biodiversity. They have to be ecologically representative. They have to be well-connected systems. That is where the scientific input is indispensable. But the law comes in when we have to look at regulations of spatial planning, for example, at the national, municipal, or even village level, but also other regulations on biodiversity acts, nature protection, but also, for example, mining and energy acts, or development or transport regulation, agriculture, subsidies. Because OECMs are something outside protected areas, will come across many different laws and regulations that may intersect and have to be studied and analyzed very carefully. In addition, we know that OECMs are expected to provide contributions to people, and that they have to be equitably managed in order to provide positive long-term outcomes. And here, projects alone will not be sustainable. We have to look at legal interventions in order to bring about long-term transformative changes. Another legal aspect, or an aspect where law comes in, is that it will be impossible to avoid negative impacts on people, in particular on indigenous peoples and local communities, and to increase positive benefits. So law will be important, regulation will be important to ensure the effective participation of stakeholders, of all relevant stakeholders, and respect their rights to lands and resources. OECMs also arguably allow for some economic activities. They're not protected areas. And here the questions, how is the balance to be struck between economic activities and benefits for biodiversity? And here again, we may have to turn to the law to provide us an answer. After all, we probably look at a combination of many different regulatory tools, and we look at different national and subnational regulations and a whole toolbox that may be at our disposal. And that's the goal of our discussions today in the next 3 hours, where we hopefully will have very engaged discussions, and we will learn from experiences that have already made in different places worldwide. And with that, I would like to turn the floor back to Professor Madhurao.
Thank you, Christina. And now I would like to welcome Dr. Kathy McKinnon, who, together with Harry Jonas, co-chairs the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Specialist Group on OECMs. She is also, until recently, the chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas. Kathy is an Oxford-trained zoologist. She spent more than 30 years working on conservation issues, especially in developing countries. For 16 years, she was the lead biodiversity specialist of the World Bank. She's also the author of over 100 scientific books and publications. In 2018, Kathy won the Midori Prize for Biodiversity, a prestigious conservation award. Without further ado, over to you, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Madhu. Good morning, everyone from the UK. I just want to give a quick overview about OECMs as background to today's discussion. As you've already heard, we are looking at a new global biodiversity framework, and the expectation is that at least 30% of terrestrial, marine, and freshwater habitats will be protected by 2030. And that's quite a way to go, because at the moment, it's only 17% of terrestrial and 8% of marine areas are protected. So recognizing and reporting OECMs is going to be critical. As has already been said, OECMs were first mentioned by the CBD in 2010 as part of IHE Target 11. But in fact, the CBD parties didn't adopt a definition and criteria until 2018. And the IUCN WCPA Task Force has prepared guidance on recognizing and reporting OECMs, which can be downloaded from the IUCN website. And that gives a basic screening tool. Both protected areas and OECMs need to be effective at protecting biodiversity. The difference between them is protected areas should have a primary conservation objective, whereas OECM areas should deliver effective conservation regardless of their management objectives. This is the definition adopted by the CBD, a geographically defined area that is not already a protected area or part of one, and governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for in situ conservation of biodiversity. And it may also have associated ecosystem functions and services, as well as social, cultural, and economic benefits. So what are the biodiversity benefits of recognizing OECMs? Christina and Madhu have already mentioned many of them: conserving important ecosystems, habitats, and wildlife corridors beyond protected areas, helping to maintain ecosystem functions and secure ecosystem services, many of which will be relevant to mitigating and adapting to climate change, protecting important habitats for range-restricted species, including important migration or breeding sites, and of course contributing to ecologically representative and well-connected conservation networks, including key biodiversity areas and transboundary areas, and as well protecting ecosystems important for traditional human uses. So the important point is they should be protecting important biodiversity. And OECMs, just like protected areas, can have a range of governance types. They can be government managed, private sector, or managed and governed by indigenous peoples and local communities, or even a combination of these different governance authorities. So I want to touch on the point that Christina made. This is not supposed to be a land grab by governments or a disempowerment of indigenous communities and local people. In fact, we see it as an opportunity for better recognition of their rights and the effective contribution they're making to conservation of biodiversity in traditional territories. Many people have worked on indigenous and community conservation areas. Many of those perhaps already would fit the criteria for protected areas. More of them will fit the criteria for OECMs because they're not managed primarily for conservation. But of course, none of those areas should be recognized and reported without consultation and agreement and free, prior, and informed consent from the indigenous peoples themselves. And just to show how important those indigenous territories may be to our overall goals of protecting biodiversity and contributing to addressing climate change, if you look at the Amazon Basin, for instance, you can see that together the mosaic of protected areas and indigenous territories covers a very large extent, which is contributing to carbon storage, connectivity, as well as biodiversity conservation, and also influencing the climate across the whole of South America. So what constitutes an OECM? Well, sites need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and the emphasis is on quality, on biodiversity outcomes, as well as quantity. And so in this table, we're showing some places that may be likely potential OECMs and others that would be unlikely. So very likely, many indigenous and community conserved areas and locally managed marine areas may well qualify as potential OECMs. There will also be privately conserved areas that are not yet recognized or reported under national legislation. There'll be some areas in production landscapes managed for conservation rather than exploitation. There's a good example in Indonesia, for instance, in the Harapan rainforest, of forest ecosystem restoration in a former logging concession. Many examples are given in a special issue of Parks, our journal, which again you can see online. Many watershed protection areas that are protecting important biodiversity may qualify. And then there'll be areas that you may not often think about in the context of conservation, but which are delivering effective outcomes because of the way they are managed long term. And that might include military training areas, for instance. It's very unlikely, on the other hand, that urban parks and other formal gardens would qualify as OECMs, nor would temporary fishing closures in place just to allow recovery of one or a few species. But permanent or long-term fisheries closures might well qualify. Highly modified landscapes are unlikely to qualify, as are policies directed specifically to a few species, such as fishing or hunting regulations over a restricted area. And most production forests that are managed commercially for logging would not qualify, even if they still have some biodiversity values. Probably they should best be considered under sustainable use targets under the CBD. So there are many opportunities through recognizing OECMs. The opportunity to engage and support a range of right holders and particularly non-state actors in local to global conservation efforts. Of course, the designation of OECMs will help expand effective conservation networks. As Christine has already said, there are big opportunities for looking at OECMs in the context of better spatial planning to mainstream biodiversity into sectoral policies and programs. And many OECMs, just like protected areas, may also be effective nature-based solutions to climate change and other global challenges. Now, there are challenges in identifying OECMs. First, there's a need to increase awareness and capacity development, and the WCPA specialist group has developed some tools for that. There are real challenges in measuring and ensuring effectiveness across different ecosystems and in areas governed by diverse authorities, and that applies to protected areas as well as OECMs. But I've highlighted in red the ones I think are particularly relevant to a discussion on legal and regulatory mechanisms. So first of all, it's how can we ensure that where these areas are managed and governed by Indigenous peoples, that we are ensuring that there is free, prior and informed consent. So that's particularly in regard to Indigenous and community conserved areas, locally managed marine areas, etc. As I said, this should not be seen as a tool to take away land use rights, but as a tool perhaps to support them. I think it's really important at national levels to be looking at which legal and regulatory mechanisms already exist or need to be developed to appropriately recognize and support OECMs. And it's also crucial to think about why are these areas already effective for delivering biodiversity outcomes, and what more needs to be done, including perhaps legislation, to ensure and support existing governance and management that is resulting in effective conservation. Of course, that may go beyond recognition of land and use rights. We may need other incentives, payments for ecosystem services, etc. Which brings us, of course, to the points about other challenges. Will OECMs need funding? How might we address that? I believe there's a presentation later on that. We don't want to see funding diverted away from poorly resource protected areas to OECMs. And we don't want OECMs to be regarded as a second-class weaker mechanism either. Both OECMs and protected areas are crucial for effective conservation and need to be recognized as such. And then there's the challenge of verifying and reporting areas as OECMs. There's a database at the World Conservation Monitoring Center for reporting OECMs. Few countries have done so already. Mostly, these will be countries reporting OECMs. The OECM decision was by parties, i.e. governments, to the CBD, and it is the parties that will be looking to see have they made those targets. Now, the WD database at WCMC will accept information from other parties, but will that need to be endorsed by national governments? So far, we don't know. So I want to leave you with a quick summary of key questions. I think if you're looking at a potential OECM, there are 3 questions to ask before you go ahead into a more detailed assessment. Is the area protecting important biodiversity? And hopefully that is going to continue long term. Is the area already a protected area or part of a protected area? In which case it wouldn't qualify as an OECM. You can't be both. And crucially, do those responsible for governance and management of the area want that area to be assessed as an OECM? Which comes back to the free, prior, and informed consent. Then I think for the purpose of today's debate, it's exciting to be thinking about how national laws, other regulatory mechanisms, even customary law, can support recognition and long-term effectiveness of OECMs. And in addition, of course, we do need to be thinking of what kinds of other support are needed to help maintain those areas and their important biodiversity outcomes. So I'm going to conclude there. Harry and I will both be on the call for any questions later. And we shared prior to the call a short technical note on OECM, which hopefully will provide some useful background. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. We will take questions during discussion. So we will quickly move on to Mr. Yukihiro Haisa, who is the Deputy Division Director, Nature Conservation Bureau, Ministry of the Environment, Japan. Mr. Haisa is currently at the Nature Conservation Bureau, and he covers every issue related to biodiversity policies, including OECMs. He joined the Ministry of the Environment, Japan in 2002, and he has experience in handling ecosystem restoration projects for 4 years and has been responsible for managing UNESCO's World Heritage Sites in Japan. After coming back to the MOE after a stint in Nairobi, he has been responsible for a wide range of biodiversity issues, including endangered species and the management of World Heritage Sites. Over to you, Mr. Haisa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Thank you very much, Dr. Madhu, for the introduction. Thank you very much. I'm Yuki from Ministry of the Environment, Japan. It is a great pleasure to make a presentation on the current status of OECM-related policy. I thank the organizer, University of Singapore, and chairs of IUCN and experts from IUCN to give me this opportunity. Let me first begin with brief illustration of Japan's biodiversity. Thanks to the geographical and geohistorical characteristics and long-term human-nature interactions with many other features, we observe high endemism in fauna and flora. For example, around 50% of our vertebrate and vascular plant species are endemic. As for amphibians, it is as high as 80%. The richness of biodiversity is well recognized in the global biodiversity arena, one of which is the World Biodiversity Hotspot selected by Conservation International. Despite of the stereotypical view of Japan as an urbanized country, around 70% of the land is covered by forests and 40% by Satoyama. The major threats to Japan's biodiversity have been identified by the National Biodiversity Strategy. Among the 4 threats, decreasing use and management of natural resources in Satoyama is a priority. Then what is Satoyama? Satoyama is a type of landscape consisting of rice fields, reservoir ponds, irrigation canals, trees, secondary forests for fuels and materials, and others ecologically interlinking and forming a complex of ecosystems. It's called as socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes, SEPLS in short. On the map shown, the green color represents Satoyama. Those areas are characterized by its rich biodiversity, thanks to the moderate human intervention. For example, 40% of endangered freshwater fish species depend on such environment. However, Satoyama is not well represented in the protected area system of Japan, nor global biodiversity recognition systems. Satoyama environment has changed due to various sociological factors, such as declining population of rural areas and declining need for biomass resources. Under such circumstances, it is now very difficult to continue the management, which usually requires very hard work and a lot of energy. In order to conserve Satoyama environment and its characteristic species, we need to enhance management activities. Other than Satoyama, there are many types of privately conserved areas like the ones listed here. They are owned and managed for some purposes. Sometimes they aim conservation itself, but sometimes not. Even they don't, as long as the areas are sustainably managed while enhancing the biodiversity conservation values, we should see them as a part of our conservation efforts. Then, why shouldn't we designate them as protected areas? For Japan, in order to achieve the 30% target only by the existing protected area system, almost 10% of the land area is needed to be legally designated. For that, landowners would need to accept the restriction regulation on development activities, which is unlikely. Besides that, when we think about the areas like Satoyama, legal restrictions on human intervention do not always work positively in terms of conservation. As I mentioned, the key is to continue the management and sustainably use the biomass. Of course, for some areas of significant representative natural beauty, we need to extend the protected areas, but those areas are limited. Thus, we believe that OECM is the key to achieve the 30% target. This slide showed the basic idea of what we are doing now. Everything on this slide is under the ongoing consideration and not yet decided. We are developing a certification scheme of areas managed by private entities and municipal bodies, in a way contributing to in situ long-term biodiversity conservation. Under the scheme, those who wish to have their land officially certified may apply to the Ministry of the Environment. After assessment by the expert group, the ministry gives a certification to the applicant. The total area of them will be calculated and registered on World Database for OECM by the ministry. For this scheme to work and be reliable, we need to have a good set of criteria. This slide showed the criteria. We refer to the definition provided by the decision 14/8 and its guidance in the Annex 2, and IUCN's guidelines and methodologies. We developed a draft set of criteria and publicly introduced it in an expert meeting held on just last Wednesday. It is divided into 4 sections: demarcation, governance, biodiversity value, and contribution to conservation. The structure is mostly same as the screening criteria suggested in the IUCN methodology. The section of associated ecosystem functions, which is independent in the Annex 2 or the decision 14/8, is integrated in the biodiversity value in our draft. This showed the items of the draft criteria. Section 1 requires the applicant site to be demarcated and its boundary clearly delineated on a map. The governance section 2 requires that the site has specified governing authority and is equitably managed. The management method needs to be clarified as well. As for the biodiversity section 3, it is designed to allow the scheme to recognize a broad range of conservation values. We know that IUCN guidelines suggest some types of ecosystems are unlikely to be identified as an OECM, such as forests for commercial logging. However, it is prudent, the guideline is prudent to add that the examples are not meant to be without exception. We think a categorical exclusion of certain types of ecosystem could narrow the opportunity. Even clear-cut forests sometimes offer very good hunting ground for endangered Japanese golden eagle, which is umbrella species. We think we need to be open in this regard, but very, very careful in the assessment. In the last section 4, we stipulate requirement on effectiveness of management, including monitoring. The certification is the first step for our journey to study by 30. Through the implementation of the certification scheme, we will be able to accumulate concrete examples of sites and refine the scheme. Furthermore, we would be able to set the baseline for each category of possible OECMs, such as municipally owned forests or small-scale natural ecosystems in urban areas, and so on. In other words, the certification scheme is to enhance private and municipal conservation efforts in a bottom-up approach, and it will eventually enable top-down identification of OECMs. To sum up, this is our land. There are many sites privately owned and managed in a way contributing to biodiversity conservation. Some of them are already in the existing protected areas. Our scheme may certify them whether they are in or out of protected areas. The certified areas will be registered on the WDOECM, but only after excluding the duplication with the protected areas. They also set the baseline to enable the government to identify entire OECMs in future. We are currently doing final tuning of the criteria. Our plan is to start pilot running of the scheme during fiscal year 2022 and officially launch in the next fiscal year 2023. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haisa. And we can now move on to Mohammad Jahido. He's the Deputy Chief Conservator of Forests in Bangladesh. Mr. Kabir has a degree in forestry from Khulna University and a master's in forestry from Chittagong University. He has a PhD in advanced wildlife management from the Wildlife Institute of India. He joined the Bangladesh Civil Service as Assistant Conservator of Forests in 2003. He now leads the Forest Management Wing of the Forest Department in Bangladesh. He's also working as the national focal point for various international organizations such as CBD, APAP, EAFB, and GTF. Over to you, Mr. Jahido.
Thank you, Dr. Madhurao. Is it visible, my presentation to you and everybody?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So this workshop looking ahead to the CBD COP15 opportunities and challenges posed by OECM. I'll talk on OECM in Bangladesh, opportunities, threats, and challenges. First of all, I'd like to introduce about the protected area system in Bangladesh. So we have legal instruments as after the formation establishment of UNEP and immediate after the liberation of Bangladesh. So our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, she adopted this law, the Bangladesh Wildlife Preservation Ordinance in 1973, and it became into law, Bangladesh Wildlife Preservation Act 1974. But after a long journey, many of the section and due to many of the international collaboration and commitment and convention, so we again formulate another law, Wildlife Conservation Security Act 2012. And subsequently, we formulate the co-management rules 2017, and that is the partnership with the community people of the area. So we have almost 8 kinds of protected area as our law, Wildlife and Conservation Security Act 2012, and that is the sanctuary, all kinds of sanctuary, wildlife sanctuary, fish sanctuary, maybe the dolphin sanctuary. We have an marine protected area under sanctuaries. We have national parks, safari park, eco park, botanical garden, special biodiversity conservation area, and also community conservation areas and national heritage conservation. These are the types of PA in our country in Bangladesh. We have also MPA, marine protected area, declared by Department of Fisheries. They declared marine reserve, and already they have declared 2 marine reserve covering an area of 3,886 square kilometer, and the Forest Department under this act we have declared marine protected area covering an area of the Swatch of No Ground 1,738 square kilometer, and another new MPA already decision finalized in the interministerial meeting. Now it is on way of Gazette notification, that is 1,743 square kilometer. So total MPA area 7,367 square kilometer, and PA coverage overall in Bangladesh up to November 2021. That is a terrestrial PA coverage in relation to country area is 3.17%, and in relation to the total forest area is 20.34% in Bangladesh, and marine protected area in relation to total territorial sea area, it is 1,18,830, that is 6.20%. So this is the overall scenario of PA in Bangladesh. Now what's about the OECM? no legal provision of OECM in Bangladesh, definitely, but we have community conservation area that could be the OECM in Bangladesh. We have to amend the act. So in community conservation area, as per Act Section 18(1), any person or community being owner of a land, he can apply, or government in his own initiative can declare this one. Purpose of management is for the protection of traditional or cultural value or use of any animal or plant, and for sustainable development of such land or wetland, and for management of wildlife. This is the overall objectives of the management can declare as community conservation area. And Section 18(3) has provision of co-management of that area, and as a decision taken by the co-management committee, warden will take initiative for implementation, and the government may, where applicable, provide compensation for the affected owner of the area. So these provisions are there in our Wildlife Conservation and Security Act relating to community conservation area that we are thinking as a potential OECM area. So I'll give example some potential OECM area that is VCF, Village Conservation Forest. What is this actually? This area located in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, the hill area of Bangladesh, bordering the Myanmar and also the India, Mizoram and other areas. For a couple of generations, indigenous people of Chittagong Hill Tracts has been conserving small patches of forest near their villages, mainly for water, bamboo, and minor forest products. These are the services they get from that forest. These small forests are known as village common forest or Mojabon in Bangla or Parabon. So these are the area we are thinking in the Chittagong Hill Tracts that we can go for a declaration in OECM. I'd like to introduce this areas. That is, there are about almost 314 VCF covering an area of 30,000 acres. And biodiversity is in threat. They are depleting very rapidly. And Arannok Foundation launched a project that Biodiversity Conservation of VCF. They do some study, and one of the VCF is Dolusuri VCF. Map is here. So they did camera trapping, line transect, and others to measure the biodiversity of that area and management, to understand the management system of that area in the VCF. So there's a unique habitat and very rich biodiversity. I'll show on the next slide that you see the around 70% amphibian of the total amphibian in the country. That is 64 species identified in the country. Out of 64, 33 is present is here. And out of 174 reptiles in the country, 61 reptiles you could find in the VCF area, and 714 birds in the country. Around 187 is found here. And out of 133 mammals of the country, 83 mammals present here, and out of 500 plant species, 5,000 plant species, 113 plant species identified here in this area, VCF area. And the area has the diversified livelihood of the indigenous community. From they are using the jhum cultivation, rice cultivation, turmeric, poultry, cattle, and pig rearing. You see in the picture, you see they are harvesting from the VCF, the bamboo shoot, and banana and other. They also cattle rearing, and you see the poultry, pig rearing. These are the their lifestyle and livelihood in that area of the VCF. Traditionally, they have some restriction. The headman or the karbari of the VCF of the village or of the community, they traditionally practicing some restriction over the areas. That is, no jhum cultivation in the VCF areas, and nobody will enter without permission from the headman or karbari. And they used to plant native tree species in that area. Immature bamboo extraction is restricted. Hunting also prohibited. And headman or karbari gives permission for harvesting the NTFP they are collecting for their livelihood. And threats and challenges, that is very important. The degradation is going very rapidly. That's definitely a threat. And population growth rate of that area is high, a bit high. So developing trust or partnership is a big challenges for the government, and because there are some land litigation in that area. So partnership is a difficult task, but not impossible at all. You have to traditional livelihood versus alternative sustainable livelihood is also a challenges, because the people of that area traditionally they will not shift their livelihood. It is very difficult to convince or motivate them and to give them an alternative. So this is challenges, but not impossible. And the amendment of existing law, definitely we have the community conservation area that is very relevant to the OECM. So we can declare this area, or we can amend our law from community conservation area to OECM, and accordingly develop rules and policies to maintain this OECM, Chittagong Hill Tracts VCF OECM in the country. So Blue Belt OECM, we have a huge, you see, Bay of Bengal and the coastal area in Bangladesh, and already declared 2 marine protected areas, Swatch of No Ground, Submarine Canyon area, and the you see the Nizumdeep Marine Reserve. So this area, and very rich in biodiversity. We have the dolphins, almost 9 types of species of dolphin, porpoise, whales, sharks, and rays, and marine turtle, that numerous species at global conservation takes. The very rich area, as it is very growing area. It's a delta and fast growing delta, and land is developing, ecosystem is gradually developing in this area, and very sensitive area also. So very rich also in biodiversity, because nutrient is coming from the upper stream Himalayan and Tibetan areas. So very rich also in biodiversity. Fisheries are the vital for food security and employment of billions of people. You can see the picture below. Millions of people are dependent actually for their livelihood on fisheries resources of these areas. So multisectoral MPA network, actually you see in the map that red color is the Swatch of No Ground, and then middle it is a black color is the Nizumdeep Marine Reserve declared by Department of Fisheries, and the Swatch of No Ground declared by the Forest Department. And again in the right lower part, that is near to Myanmar border, St. Martin Island, and St. Martin Island MPA declared by the Forest Department, Bangladesh. So different agencies, different sectors are actually operating in these areas. Department of Fisheries, Forest Department, you see the Navy, Coast Guard, they are also operating, and also mining also operating. And one of the island already Rohingya refugees has been re-established, resettled in these areas. So diverse factors, port, seaport, land port, it is also and also the you see electricity generating company, so they are also working in this area. And so multisectoral marine protected area can make a strong contribution to protect threatened marine wildlife and promoting sustainable fisheries by protecting fish spawning ground. As I have mentioned earlier, the nutrient is coming from the upstream, so very nutrient rich area in this area, and this is very rich fish spawning ground of Bangladesh, and we need to protect this habitat actually. So you see the map in the right side. So this is the dolphin area, a Gangetic dolphin inside the Sundarban. Iravathi dolphin, very rich population, around more than 6,000 individuals so far identified in this area. Fish population is very high. Production is very high, and also in the submarine canyon area, British whale we could find here in this area, and the St. Martin area also. So we are thinking to propose 2,700 square kilometer area connecting these two MPA. WCS Bangladesh is working with the Forest Department and Department of Fisheries to establish the Blue Belt OECM in Bangladesh that connects these two PAs, source of no ground marine protected area and Nizamdeep marine protected area, as well as we have 5 terrestrial protected area. These are the coastal Nizamdeep National Park, Chor Kukri Mukri Wildlife Sanctuary, Sonarchar Wildlife Sanctuary, Tangragiri Wildlife Sanctuary, and Sundarban Reserve Forest and the Wildlife Sanctuary. So we are trying to connect all these territorial protected area and 2 marine protected area, and in between this area the huge biodiversity and the marine wildlife is here. So to protect that biodiversity and to connect this protected 5 territorial and 2 marine protected area, we are trying to establish Blue Belt OECM in Bangladesh. So threats and challenges for Blue Belt OECM, that is huge development work in coastal regional.
Mr. Jahido, if I may please request if you can wrap up very quickly.
Yes, this is my last slide.
Okay,
huge development work in coastal region of Bangladesh, seaport is coming, power plant, industries, etc. That's a challenge. Livelihood of millions of people depends on coastal and marine fisheries. You see the picture in the right, and also amendment of act, development of new rules and policies for Blue Belt OECM. It may take some time, and definitely inter-agency partnership and partnership with artisan and commercial fishermen, partnership with the Department of Fisheries, Customs, Navy and Coast Guard, and the Bangladesh Police and Border Guard Bangladesh is required for maintaining this Blue Belt OECM in Bangladesh. So thank you very much for hearing, patient sharing to all.
Thank you, Mr. Jahido. That is a fantastic presentation. We move on to the next speaker, Dr. Vinod Mathur. He's the chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority of India. After serving for 33 years at the prestigious WII, or the Wildlife Institute of India, including as the Dean, he was appointed as the 11th chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority in 2019. Over to you, Dr. Mathur.
Thank you, Dr. Madhu. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
What I plan to do in the next 8 to 9 minutes is to talk about India's initiative on the OECM front. And as you can see, it's titled or subtitled as Expanding India's Conservation Agenda. Now, the story of OECMs, as you just said, is not more than 5 years. And the Indian story is less than 18 months. It was only in June 2020 that we started looking into it. We realized the importance of having OECMs. We set up a working group. Our first brief was to look at what can qualify as an OECM. I must say that there is some global guidance available, but when you start looking at it, you run into some kind of issues over there. So what we have been able to do, as you can see, it's a work in progress, trying to identify that what can constitute in our OECM estate. And the first thing we looked at, that we have lands under terrestrial, lands under wetlands. Wetlands again are classified as inland wetlands and coastal wetlands, and we also have marine areas. So we wanted to look at the whole spectrum of the areas which could be considered under the OECM, and that is where we now have an initial criteria of 16 categories. Now, developing a criteria, developing a guideline is one thing. It should be easily understandable to people. And that's where we applied our minds to hold consultations, that what can constitute as one of these 16 categories under the OECMs that we are talking. And we have provided a small description. The big challenge is that every time you start looking at an area as an OECM or a potential OECM, you run into an issue that is it not an already designated PA. So there would be an issue of dual counting over there. And that is what we wanted to bring in as much clarity as possible to see that we cover this estate. Last November, few months back, 2 months back, India is also a party of the 30 by 30 High Ambition Coalition. We understand the importance of designating conservation space, and that is where we look at OECMs as the big opportunities to do that. Now we want to get out and reach out to the conservation community at large. And with the help of UNDP India, we have set up an OECM Web Portal that you can see. Anybody who has an idea, has some interesting facts to share, can put up information which our teams are going to work over there. So this is what we plan to move on the OECM trajectory over there. But what I want to present very briefly, there are certain very important areas which have not been covered so far under the PA network. This could be an Aravali Park in the urban areas of Gurgaon. It could be sacred groves in Arunachal Pradesh. It could be also, we are looking at the industrial estate. This is where we see a huge opportunity. Huge industries in India have huge estate. These estates are potential sites to be considered for declaring as OECMs. So we are talking to these corporates over there who have interest, who have funds, who have a wherewithal to declare and to consider their areas coming under OECMs. But coming very quickly to challenges, some of which were very aptly described by Kathy, lack of awareness. See, even after all these years, we still want to define, make people understand what these OECMs are. And I want to make a very special mention of this phrase which has been around OECM, case-by-case approach. See, case-by-case approach is very good. It shows dynamism, it shows flexibility, but it also introduces an element of uncertainty. What is an OECM here and what is not an OECM there needs to be studied very carefully. We have to be as much clear and unambiguous over there. There is a huge issue now already with the PAs reporting to WCPA, the UN UNEP database. And now when you start adding the OECM database, we perceive that there will be some issues there too, because their system is defined and structured and operated in a different manner. We need to look at how do we manage and monitor the OECMs, because it is not just identifying them. Ultimately, there has to be some management. There has to be some monitoring. Kathy and others have been talking about effectiveness, the management effectiveness of PAs. Last 20, 25 years, we have done a lot of work on that. But can we do a similar thing in the context of OECMs? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we will need to have an idea and a sense that these management effectiveness is very, very important for OECM. So what we see as a way ahead, this is my last slide, we want to initiate a pan-India process of identification, preparation of dossier, which can be recognized, which can be uploaded, which can be shared with people. And we need to have orientation meetings with various target groups. As I said, top of the line are corporates. We have academic and research institutions in India, which have huge areas under their disposal. These areas can serve as potential OECM. The Indian Railway Network has huge areas under its command. The defense and military cantonments also have huge areas. So we now need to go one by one with them, explain to them that what it makes to consider those areas under OECMs. The corporate social responsibility funds can also be made available for managing them. This issue was raised because funding will be required. PAs require funding, OECMs will require funding. Where from this funding will come? Can we unlock some new sources of funding or not? We are already now working on capacity building programs where we are engaging youth, we are engaging young students, and we want to internalize them into the process of OECM. And ultimately, we want to have a very strong mechanism with the corporate and conservation engagement. This is what is our dream, that we need to look at new grounds, we need to look at new sources, we need to look at new ideas, and we need to break away from the very restrictive concept of the protected areas that we have been practicing. There is a larger issue. I take this opportunity, both the chair of the environmental law is here and the chair of WCPA is here. I want to raise this issue here that we need to look at very clearly that what is that legal framework going to give? Should it be invoke it right now or should we wait it for some time? Because we want people to understand that these OECMs have a multiple role to play. If we get too much into the legal process right at the start, I'm afraid we will run into some kind of difficulties. Enacting law in our part of the world is not easy. People who have been following, whether it is agriculture or industry, it's very, very difficult. So I want to sound my own word of caution that we need to take a very due diligence. Are we better off in creating a legal regime, or we move slowly? We need to make people understand that OECMs are important, spaces are important. If we need to achieve the 30 by 30 target of high ambition coalition, we need to be very, very dynamic, acceptable, and flexible. Local communities have always had fears about protected areas. If you now come up with another designation, another idea, they will still be very skeptical on that. So my point of raising this point here is, maybe we cannot solve it in today's debate, but yes, we need to look at very carefully the legal dimensions of it, and situations differ from country to country. But I would say we need to be absolutely clear what we will get, what we will achieve, what we will lose if we go further on this legal front. Thank you very much for providing this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur, for that excellent presentation. I'm afraid we're running short of time, but we will take one question, which is in the Q&A box from William Dunbar. The question is for Mr. Haisa or other panelists. How to ensure that certified OECMs will be managed permanently, or at least in the long term? Private owners may want to develop them economically later, or their next generations of owners may want to. Thank you, Mr. Haisa, if you can take that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William, for that very good question. And the shortest answer is we'll consider it during our pilot running of the certification scheme. But basically, we will need to depend on the voluntary commitment by the landowners or managers of the site. One of the reasons is just raised by Dr. Binodo Mathur in the last presentation. We are seeing the OECM as an opportunity to make private entities and municipal bodies participate in the area of biodiversity conservation. So currently we see this political issue rather than legal issues of legal issue. Currently, we are focusing to involve municipal authorities and private entities in conservation. And so for the moment, we are depending on the voluntary commitment by landowners. But later, we will need to come up with a very good solution or innovative way to effectively monitor the certificated sites in order to assure that the biodiversity value claimed at the timing of application is maintained for long term. So this is our current idea, and everything is under the consideration. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Haisa. And if I can just direct that to Dr. Mathur, if you can please respond to the same question. And given you said that you are going to engage the corporate sector in India, what do you think will be the incentive for the corporate sector to conserve biodiversity in the long term? And how do you ensure that?
Thank you, Madhu. My quick response is for the corporates, the most important thing is the reputational benefits. And that is something which corporates would be very keen. We have been talking to some of them, and we are trying to explain that conserving or investment in conservation is a reputational advantage to their businesses. And that is where, if they already have these estates, if these estates can be maintained and managed for soil, water, moisture, carbon, and connectivity conservation, it would be a win-win for everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. There are no other open questions, and I'm going to have to end this because we're running short of time. We do have a very quick break, and we will reconvene in about 8 minutes at 4:50 Singapore time for the second session. So thank you, everyone, for this first session, to the speakers, to the participants, and we will see you very soon. Thank you.
I would like to welcome everyone back from that very brief break we had, and I'd like to add my thanks to Madhu's, to the previous three speakers for their excellent presentations, and I hope you can stay online with us. There will be some more chances for questions and answers towards the end, hopefully, and maybe there will be some questions to you, so please stay with us. We will continue discussing the policy and legal dimensions of OECMs, first in a particular geographical setting, and then we move on to more wider discussions on legal issues. But it's with great pleasure that I first would like to welcome Candice Stevens. She has sent us a pre-recorded message. Candice is the head of innovative finance. She is a finance expert, or green finance expert, head of innovative finance and policy at WFA, and she is the chair of Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition in South Africa. And I would like to ask Absel, our supporters here, to please play Candice recording.
Greetings from South Africa. My name is Candice Stevens. I'm chair of the Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition, which implements innovative financial solutions for conservation landscapes across Africa. I also have the privilege of being the head of innovative finance and policy for Wilderness Foundation Africa. And my role there is really around creating financial solutions for protected and conserved areas, or OECMs. I've been asked to speak to OECMs within the South African context. I'm going to share my screen now to discuss some of the findings that we've had from the South African context, particularly in terms of alignment with South Africa's national legal and policy structures around our protected areas, and what are referred to in South Africa as conservation areas, which align with OECMs internationally. The alignment with OECMs and biodiversity stewardship in the South African context was really a critical component in being able to assess OECMs in our country context and ensuring that we don't duplicate efforts, but rather align with existing legislative and policy frameworks, as well as with communities of practice in the South African context. Biodiversity stewardship is an approach to entering into agreements with landowners, both private and communal, by conservation authorities and supported by conservation NGOs. This initiative is highly successful in South Africa, it's highly economic, and it has allowed us to increase the protected area state in South Africa. But more than that, it has also allowed South Africa to increase its conservation area state. What you'll see up on screen now is a diagram very briefly at a high level illustrating the biodiversity stewardship approach and how it aligns and interlinks with South African national legislation on protected areas. South Africa's protected areas are defined by our Protected Areas Act, referred simply to as NEMPA, and the Protected Areas Act has a number of protected areas that may be declared on state, private, or communally owned land. Our primary declarations in terms of protected areas in the South African context under biodiversity stewardship relate to national parks, state, private, and communal, nature reserves, and protected environments. Biodiversity stewardship has a second category, however, referred to as conservation areas. And under conservation areas, agreements are declared through different utilities in law, from property law to contract law or hybrid agreements, or under different pieces of legislation, such as the Biodiversity Act. And you'll see three primary conservation area agreements listed on the right-hand side: biodiversity management agreements, biodiversity agreements, and conservation servitudes. These are the primary focus of the OECM assessments in the South African context. But biodiversity stewardship also has a third category, referred to very broadly as biodiversity partnership areas. And this has a non-exhaustive list of a range of different interventions and activities by stakeholders across the South African landscape. These are also being assessed in terms of the OECM criteria. And if they meet the OECM criteria, there is the potential for them to be placed in category 2 under conservation areas. Now, it's critically important for me to add at this point that the South African government, under the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, has a database that covers both protected areas and conservation areas. The key opportunity in the South African context is to be able to assess South Africa's conservation areas with the OECM methodology that's been developed at a global level within our own country context, vet those areas, and then be able to add them to our packet database and report them up into global targets. What I've shown on the screen now is that biodiversity stewardship hierarchy with its categories 1, 2, and 3. And what you'll see here is the alignment with protected areas, privately protected areas, and OECMs. Now, we know that OECMs are not protected areas, which includes privately protected areas. And so in the South African context, being able to assess OECMs through biodiversity stewardship allowed us very clearly to place that dividing line between protected areas and OECMs. And so the focus of OECM assessments in South Africa is on areas that are not protected areas or privately protected areas. These areas sit within conservation areas and then lower down with biodiversity partnership areas. And this was really a critical component in aligning the South African context with global policy. The South African OECM project was run by myself and Daniel Marnowick with assistance from national government and the South African National Biodiversity Institute. The project was the first of its kind to be run at a national level, and we were able to align biodiversity stewardship and South Africa's national and legislative policy frameworks with the OECM definition that was adopted in 2018 in Egypt. The project had three primary aims. We wanted to ensure that government had the right tool set to be able to institutionalize OECMs within that conservation area definition. We also wanted to be able to support the integration of the OECM definition with what was already happening in country. Now, this is critically important, that OECMs were not something new or something different or some additional effort being placed on communities of practice in South Africa, but rather a global tool that allowed their efforts to be recognized. Now, these are existing efforts that are highly effective and have been rolled out for a number of years, and OECMs give the opportunity for that global recognition to come to those conservation area efforts in country. And then lastly, OECMs also give us an additional opportunity in enhancing those efforts, particularly when it comes to sustainable financing. And we're currently running an exciting new pilot on a candidate OECM in South Africa and a dedicated finance solution for that OECM. Through this project, a number of sites were engaged with a large amount of stakeholder engagement. We really aligned with existing efforts in country, which is something that we truly advocate for in looking for OECM assessments. And it was run with a range of different partners, and you'll see them up on screen. Very briefly, the OECM criteria, which I think you're all familiar with, these were taken and applied within the South African biodiversity stewardship context to be able to assess those conservation areas and broader biodiversity partnership areas to determine whether or not they met the OECM criteria. The results of our findings out of 9 sites that were assessed, 3 did not qualify, 6 did qualify, which is really an exciting statistic. So this was over 16,000 hectares in biodiversity priority areas, which is really critically important. And you'll see that infographic on your screen around the biodiversity value across these 9 sites. South Africa is in the very fortunate position to have extensive spatial planning around biodiversity and ecological infrastructure priority areas. And we were able to then focus our assessment in these priority areas, which is really critically important. This is a map of the area that we focused. That giant green blob is Kruger National Park, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. It's a vast protected area. And in and around this are a number of privately and communally owned and managed nature reserves or contract national parks. But in between that, there are puzzle pieces of areas that are being well managed with effective biodiversity conservation outcomes that we assessed in terms of the OECM criteria. These areas were listed as conservation areas, predominantly within the biodiversity stewardship context in South Africa. And like I said, 6 of those 9 sites met the OECM criteria in this preliminary assessment. And we can really see the opportunity of the OECM assessments in this context, in that it connects all of those protected areas with OECMs in an interconnected landscape. And the benefits of that connectivity, particularly in large landscapes like this, is really critically important. So what is happening now in South Africa, very excitingly, is that OECM assessments are underway in the Western Cape Province in South Africa, a project run by BirdLife South Africa together with Cape Nature, as well as efforts by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment in terms of institutionalizing OECMs and building them into the government's frameworks around recognition and reporting. And that process is underway. We also have ongoing technical assessments and alignment with biodiversity stewardship through the National Biodiversity Stewardship Technical Working Group. And like I mentioned before, finance solutions attached to OECMs through a biodiversity management agreement tax incentive project led by the Coalition and Wilderness Foundation Africa. What I'd really like to highlight in conclusion is the fact that OECMs worked in the South African context from the onset because of the alignment with our existing efforts through biodiversity stewardship and our legislative and policy frameworks. And being able to match those up and work together with national government as well as the community of practice streamlined the process of assessments and ensured that we could differentiate between protected areas and OECMs, but at the same time apply them in a connected approach to landscape and really see the maximum opportunities achieved around OECMs. I sincerely hope that this is helpful in this discussion, and good luck to other countries assessing OECMs. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank Candice in person, but very much appreciative of the recorded message as well. I thought it was in particular interesting to hear about the alignment with the legislative and policy framework, but also the structure around financial incentives, especially tax incentives. That might be something worthwhile to consider. But without further ado, we would like to go to yet another part of the world, to Latin America, and I'd like to invite the pre-recorded message by Clara Matallana Tobon and Marcela Santamaria. Clara works at Conservation Strategies in Colombia, and Marcela Santamaria works at Res Natura, also in Colombia. I ask to play the pre-recorded message, please.
Good day. My name is Marcela Santamaria. I'm the technical coordinator of Res Natura, the Colombian network of civil society nature reserve. And today we are going to present some of the main results that we have achieved through a project in Colombia that has applied OECM criteria to the Colombian context. This is a project that has been financed by the GIF Small Grant Programs since June 2019, and it's a joint effort of an interinstitutional working group that includes Res Natura, Instituto Humboldt, Fundación Natura Colombia, and the regional local protected area of GIZ ICLEI IUCN. So as part of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Colombia has complied to the decision 14.8. And this OECM international framework is seen as an opportunity to highlight all these area-based initiatives that have been existing in the Colombian territory since decades, especially in a mega-diverse and culturally rich country with nearly 34% of the area in Colombia is under indigenous and peasant reserves and Afro-Colombian territories. This is even more important taking into account that the national system of protected areas in Colombia includes only public and private governance. Therefore, this key actor, as well as local governments and some private right holders, are essential to do these conservation initiatives beyond protected areas. So the main goals of our project was, first of all, to do the identification of potential OECMs according to the experience of the partners of the project, and taking into account a database that exists since 2014 of conservation area-based initiatives beyond protected areas. We then focused on the application of OECM criteria for certain cases, according with right holders and through a bottom-up approach. We then select 8 cases to do a strengthening action plans that were implemented by these 8 cases. And finally, the third one, we focus very strong on the reporting OECM to WCMC database. We work on a national route, and currently, we are going to finish our work in 2 weeks' time, and we are still working on reporting 2 or 3 more areas to WCMC. So first of all, we do the identification of, we work with 28 potential OECMs, and we try to cover all the 4 types of governance that has been considered for protected areas and conserved areas. We then apply a participative methodology, a very practical methodology that includes a series of questions according to the criteria that is in the IUCN guidelines and the decision 14.8. As you see, we did this with right holders, and we then apply all together the colors of a traffic light to do like a validation process. At the end, this validation process could lead to understand if the area could meet the all criteria and therefore could be reported as an OECM if they wanted to. We then, the second option was that strengthening actions were required in order to comply with the definition of OECM. And third, the case could not comply with OECM.
Okay, so now I'm going to introduce myself and continue with the presentation. I'm Clara Matallana. I'm an ecologist. Actually, I'm a consultant with this OECM project, and I have been working as part of the OECM specialist group of the IUCN. So basically, I will tell you how we have been working in the third objective of this project, that is to build and adopt a national reporting route to the WCMC database. So the aim of this objective was to have a strong, robust, and participative process to report OECMs. So the route was built with the Ministry of Environment and other organizations here in Colombia that were participating in the project. And we review the process with WCMC. We include some verifiers with different backgrounds and knowledge of conservation strategies that review each of the cases to see if that they meet with the OECM criteria. Having OECM reported to the WCMC database is very important for Colombia, and it is because it will help to highlight the diversity of conservation processes and allow them to be part of the regional land planning, and also will help to do fundraising. Colombia is the first country in Latin America to have OECM in the WCMC database. As Marcela mentioned, we have already 2 reported cases to the database, and we will have more in the following months. I'm going to show you one of the examples that we have in this project. This is a place that is located in the Caribbean coast of Colombia, in the region called Montes de Maria, that was very affected by the armed conflict. The site is called Salto Topacio Natural Reserve. Their main motivation for build this conservation process is the vindication of women's rights to have access to work and to make their own decisions. Also, they work in watershed conservation in an area where water is scarce. The most important ecosystem in this area is the tropical dry forest, and they work in the sustainable production of yam to guarantee the incomes for the community. Under the OECM project, they focus on the strengthening of the governance, also building good water management practice, and also to build a good yam production practice that will be sustainable. To have this, they have been working in this project, and they will report 15 hectares of tropical dry forest to the WCMC database. So we have our main conclusions on this project, and with all the processes that we have been working with these cases. And basically, we see that the OECM framework is not seen as another complicated approach to identify conservation strategies, but is seen as a tool to recognize other forms of conservation and governance in Colombia, as we mentioned, in areas that have existed for many decades. Also, Colombia has made an important progress on identifying OECMs that involves different actors, public, private, and community actors at different levels, such as local and national level. But many alliances and resources will be required to monitor, support, and report OECMs, and to complete a national inventory of potential OECMs. And also, we will be needing more capacity building to apply the criteria, to monitor the biodiversity outcomes, and also to keep strengthening the governance processes, so we can continue to report and to strengthen these processes, and also to show how the country is complying the national and international goals of biodiversity conservation.
And just finishing this presentation, we want just a very short message. We think that the application of the criteria help the right holders to understand, to stop for a moment, and to do like a self-process and self-evaluation of their conservation processes. I think with this very practical methodology, very important results can be found. Thank you very much, and just finish to show the team of this project that is going to finish in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Clara and Marcela for their fantastic and very informative presentation. It is very interesting to see the focus on OECMs as an opportunity to highlight already existing area-based initiatives, but also as a tool to strengthen rights of indigenous communities, rights of women. So it's something that adds on to something that is already on its way and gives another layer of legitimacy and protection. Without further ado, please let us move forward to our next speaker, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Sandy Patterson. Professor Patterson is working at the Faculty of Law at the University of Cape Town, and he is a member both of WCPA and WCEL. Sandy, you have the floor.
Christina, can I just check that you have my screen sharing at the moment?
Yes, we do. Beautiful
Oh,
slide.
great. Thanks so much for the opportunity to participate in this particular webinar. I've been asked to provide some general perspectives on law and policy in the context of OECMs. And those of you who know lawyers should know that lawyers always start with a few caveats or a few provisos. So here are some of my provisos. I'm near the end of a line of presenters, which always raises the pressure a little, as there's always the potential that others may have said what you wish to say. Fortunately, I think what I have to say complements that of many of the prior excellent presentations. To a degree, I feel like one of these little boys in this particular picture. The reason for that, a little boy peering in from the cracks from the outside of the door inwards, is that I haven't been involved in the WCPA OECM task team or the subsequent specialist group. And I was not present at the important discussions which no doubt took place at the recent WCCC. But I guess an outside or an external eye or a voice is never a bad thing. Finally, with but 10 minutes, I bring a very bird's eye view, such as this bird's eye view of the Torres del Paine Reserve in Chile. I naturally cannot go into huge amounts of detail, and therefore I framed my presentation or my contribution as a brief bird's eye perspective on the role of law and policy and its link in the context of OECMs. I perceive this as a first step towards the future, more detailed discussion on this particular issue. Having dealt with those few caveats, I think it important to highlight a couple of issues relating to law generally. My principal focus is on the law. So what do I mean by the law, or what do I understand by the law? One needs to recognize that there are many diverse array of sources of law. They can include legislation, the common law and customary law, and practice. This links through to the need, in my mind, to acknowledge and recognize the important role of legal pluralism. For example, legislation may set out the process to recognize or report on OECMs. The common law may regulate the rules relating to conservation servitudes or easements and other contractual arrangements relevant to OECMs. Customary law and practice may underpin ICCAs, which could constitute OECMs. I also think it's important to highlight that many commonly view the law as simply a discipline that regulates and controls and restricts what can be done. But the law is also a crucial enabler. It's a crucial discipline that enables and empowers people and institutions to do certain things. I note my task is to focus on both the role of law and policy. So what do I understand about policy and what is its potential role? Policy includes a diversity of things, such as government policies, strategies, guidelines, and programs. And policy generally fulfills one of two main functions. It can inform the development of the law, and it can inform the implementation of the law. It is accordingly highly relevant in the context of OECMs. But given that I have but 10 minutes, I'm principally going to focus on the role of law in the next 7 or so minutes. I want to recognize that law provides both potential benefits and potential limitations in the context of OECMs. Considering the potential benefits, law ideally provides consistency, certainty, and clarity. And this is often essential for the regulated community and could even encourage members of the regulated community to support OECM initiatives. On the other hand, considering the limitations, law can be perceived as restrictive and rigid. This could lead to reluctance on the part of the regulated community to support OECM initiatives where they perceive these as overly regulated, rigid, or restrictive. And this is something Dr. Mathur was referring to in his particular presentation too. So therefore, a careful and creative balance may accordingly be needed when utilizing the law or thinking through the role of the law to promote OECM initiatives. Picture each of these pebbles on this particular slide as a different country or a different situation. Each of these particular pebbles differs in color, differs in shape, texture, composition, size, and weight. And as with each of these particular pebbles, each country's situation differs significantly in respect of many different factors, such as those on the screen. These differences need to be acknowledged when considering the role of law and policy in the context of OECMs, as there doesn't necessarily seem to be a single solution or model which fits every country in every different context. Like this layered cake, law often plays out at many different levels or in many different spheres, and there may well be laws in each of the spheres reflected on the screen or the levels reflected on the screen. And this needs to be recognized when thinking through the role of law and policy in the context of OECMs. And efforts clearly need to be made to promote alignment and integration across these different spheres and these different laws. Finally, there may be a blend of many different areas of law of relevance to OECMs, and I've just reflected a couple of those areas of law on the screen. One therefore needs to think carefully, look carefully through these different areas of law with a view to properly scoping and understanding the influence and the potential role of law in the context of OECMs. Having done so, one would then potentially be in a position to identify what additions to make or what amendments to make. So there's that first key process, is to carefully scope the existing role and the existing influence of law before moving towards making additions or making amendments. So what would be a good lens to choose to begin this process of scoping and understanding the current and the potential role or influence of law in the context of OECMs? Perhaps one good place to start would be the definition of an OECM, which Kathy introduced us to in the opening session of this particular webinar. That definition contained in the decision 14.8 and elaborately reflected in these particular set of guidelines. As Kathy illustrated when she introduced this particular definition, it contains a whole series of criteria and several definitional elements. On this particular screen, I've simply taken out each of those definitional elements and reflected them in these black hoops on this particular screen. Law seems to impact upon, influence, or have a role in facilitating the implementation of each of these particular elements. Putting it in another way, each of these elements seems to raise legal issues and accordingly have a legal dimension. I know my time is running out, so let me give you a brief reflection of what I mean, focusing on those particular elements which have stars appearing next door to them. On this particular table, you will note 3 columns. In the left-hand column of the table is the definitional element, in this case, the geographically defined area. In the center column are key aspects of the explanation linked to this element, which I've drawn from the OECM guidelines. And on the right-hand column are key legal questions, which I perceive as linked to that particular definitional element contained in the broader definition of an OECM. So if one reflects on these particular questions, you will note questions to the effect, does the law provide for the identification of these areas for recognition as OECMs? Does the law, for instance, prescribe a set of criteria? Does it prescribe a set of planning instruments which can be used to identify key biodiversity areas, for instance? Does the law provide for the formal recognition of OECMs? Does the law provide for the initial demarcation? Because if we're talking about spatially delineated areas, one would anticipate there being some initial demarcation and potentially, if one reads further through that particular information linked to this definitional element, to alter them in certain circumstances. Does the law prescribe who can initiate this process? And if one moves towards the latter parts of that particular column on the right, crucial issues include, what is the impact of the recognition on OECMs on existing rights, such as land rights, water rights, mineral rights, oil rights, gas rights, and marine living resources? And in the context of indigenous and local communities, how does the law deal with the issue of land tenure, in particular communal and traditional forms of tenure, often characterized by nested or overlapping rights, and the communal property institutions which hold those particular rights? A similar exercise can be done with many of these particular definitional elements on this particular slide is that attempted exercise undertaken in the context of management. Once again, in the center column, some of the information which appears in the OECM guidelines linked to that particular definitional element. And on the right-hand side, there's a series of questions. Does the law prescribe a set of principles to inform the management of OECMs? And if so, what are these particular principles? Does the law prescribe management objectives or standards for the OECMs linked to their ultimate conservation outcomes? And if so, what are these? Does the law provide for the appointment of management authorities and so forth, or the recognition of management authorities? And if one moves down that list of questions and one moves towards the latter half of it, they increasingly focus on the issue around monitoring and reporting. Does the law contain management monitoring and reporting requirements? Does the law contain measures to hold management authorities to account? And if so, how? Does the law provide for the regulation of activities? And if so, how? And how does the law deal with or recognize management through customary law and practice? And if so, how does it do so? An additional element is sustained long-term conservation, and there are a whole series of questions which arise in that particular context. And I think I flipped through one of the elements which I was going to cover, which is governed. One could focus on the legal questions which arise in the context of governance types and the legal questions which can arise in the context of good governance. And this issue of good governance linked back to many of the things the prior presenters have indicated. Recognition of human rights. How does the law recognize the land and the resource rights of the indigenous peoples and local communities? And if so, how? How does the law promote those key components linked to good governance, such as participation, transparency, predictability, equity, justice? And what are the legal mechanisms to do so? So what I'm trying to do through this particular exercise is just highlight a mechanism which could be used to particularly scope that first step, scope the current role or influence of law in the context of these different definitional elements contained in the broader definition of OECMs. And I think it is very much a step-by-step approach, with that first step being probably best focused on understanding how the law currently facilitates or influences or hinders the recognition and management of OECMs. And having established that important baseline, then to take the next step, to think creatively about how could the law be used or amended to better facilitate and recognize and manage OECMs. To close, I think it valuable to remember that there lies an important interface between the scientists and the lawyers, or the science and the law. There should accordingly be a strong partnership between the scientists and the lawyers, and I think this initiative is a great initiative of that particular nature. What the lawyers need to remember at all times is that the law should be informed by the science, and in turn, what the scientists should ideally seek to remember is that law influences and can play an important role in promoting and supporting the outcomes or goals identified by the particular science. If one looks through this through the microcosm of the IUCN, on the left-hand side of this particular slide, I've simply picked up some of the key guidance or the key guidelines produced by the social scientists and the conservation scientists over the course of the last decade or so of general relevance to both protected and conserved areas. On the right-hand side are some of the key guidelines produced by the lawyers, again, of general relevance to protected areas and conserved areas, and some of them are of key specific relevance to OECMs, particularly the latter two, the legal aspects of connectivity conservation, and the most recent published on integrated planning. Now, when looking through these particular resources, a couple of things seem fairly evident. Reflections on law and policy in the majority of the guidelines produced by the scientific colleagues appear to be somewhat few and far between. And the other reflection is that the lawyers are clearly not keeping a pace with the important work of their scientific colleagues, which leads me to pose my final question. How do we continue to reinvigorate and strengthen this partnership between the scientists and the lawyers? Do we need to consider finalizing those crucial guidelines which were mooted on rights and governance, which would be key in the context of OECMs, particularly including a legal component within those guidelines? Do we need to think about updating the protected areas law guidelines, which were published over a decade ago to factor in contemporary developments of the last decade? And most specifically in the context of OECMs, do we not need to begin work on developing a complementary set of guidelines focusing particularly on the link between OECMs and the law and policy? So thank you very much again for the opportunity to participate in this particular webinar, which I hope triggers rich further debate between the scientists and the lawyers from across the globe on the role and potential influence of law and policy on OECMs.
Thank you so much, Sandy, Professor Patterson. Thank you for your reflections and very, very important messages in the end. And of course, we completely share your view that there needs to be a closer cooperation between the scientists and the lawyers because it's such an interconnected area. And thank you also for running through or breaking down the different elements of the definition that we so far have. We may see additional elements coming out of the COP in Kunming attached to OECMs, in particular when it comes to equitably managed and ecologically representative elements that may be added by the Conference of the Parties, which we will have to consider. But working closer together between the scientists and the lawyers and policymakers is, of course, one of the objectives of this seminar, and it's, I hope, the first of many to come. Thank you so much. Let me move to the final speaker in this part of our program, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Nilofer Oral. Nilofer is the director of the Center of International Law at the National University of Singapore. She is also a member of the International Law Commission, and Nilofer is also a long-standing steering committee member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. Nilofer, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Christina, for your very kind introduction. And I have to say, I thank WCEL and also APSL for inviting CIL to be part of this important webinar. And I think it's a representation exactly of the interface. This is an active interface between the science and the law. So I know we're out of time. I'm the last speaker on this, so I'll be very, very brief, I hope. I'm going to now look at the issue. It's very interesting indeed, the OECMs, which the focus of this webinar has understandably been on within national jurisdiction at the domestic level. So I think what I would like to discuss and raise some questions is whether we can take this to another level, and that is the international global level and in relation to the ocean, the high seas, because some of you may or may not know, but indeed the high seas represents about 2/3 of ocean space. And it's an area that from the legal perspective is not under the single jurisdiction of any state. And indeed, the high seas is subject to the freedom of navigation, an open access resource, shall we say, although, you know, we still have to, there are some restrictions, but basically that is the current legal framework. And we also know, of course, that biodiversity of the ocean, including in areas beyond national jurisdiction, is under threat directly from human activities, both directly and indirectly. And indeed, every report on the state of the ocean reveals a crisis. So clearly, this is a very important issue. And as we know, marine protected areas play an important role in marine conservation and building resilience against risks such as climate change. Now, in the interest of time, there has been a growing movement to extend marine protected areas into the high seas. So far, this has been under regional regimes. Now there is a negotiation at the United Nations for a new legal framework that for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and here we mean high seas. And it includes measures such as area-based management tools, including MPAs. So that language is broad enough, obviously, to include within it OECDs, although I'm not sure that was in mind, but certainly. And this March, if things go smoothly, this will be the final phase of negotiations at the UN. So the question is, can we transpose the OECD system into this new instrument? Maybe we don't have to say it expressly, but certainly it will be important in understanding how this might happen. And in particular, I think it's interesting that, of course, it's not a marine protected area, and but it is an important tool for conservation purposes. And the question was raised concerning the relationship between economic activities. And for the high seas area, this is very key because we have many activities going on, from fishing, shipping, and even we can talk about bioprospecting for marine genetic resources. So I think it's very interesting because it does provide an option to states in finding an intermediate and interconnected between an area that may be clearly marine protected area, but then something in between. Although I have to say, in listening to the speakers, how much economic activity is allowed is still, perhaps debatable. That's why I found very interesting Jahido Kabri's presentation on the Blue Belt OECMs and the multisectoral MPAs in Bangladesh. So very, very interesting. So the question is, how could we transpose OECMs for the high seas? Would we have to actually put it into the BBNJ agreement now, or would it be implicit in the existing mandate as it is? It is an interesting concept to think of it as a transitional belt between national jurisdiction areas and the high seas. So this may be one way to look at as well. And I will just stop here and thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank all the speakers for their very insightful presentations.
Thank you so much, dear Nilofer. Thank you also for drawing our attention to areas outside national jurisdiction. We started the seminar by talking about this proposed new target 3 in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. That target, as it now is drafted, talks about a global goal of 30% by 2030, including areas beyond national jurisdiction. And following the negotiations, parties do indeed talk about areas that lie outside national jurisdictions. And the question is indeed there, how does the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework relate to the hopefully newly adopted BBNJ agreement sometime next year? And I think that's a very interesting area to explore further. Now, thank you. We do have a couple of minutes left to invite some questions. I see there is one question in the chat, which I will pose, but I ask the audience to please add some more questions in the Q&A box if you have some. The question that is there, I'd like to pose perhaps to Sandy, and the question is, how can we involve more corporate lawyers, private lawyers from law firms or work in corporations? How can we involve those lawyers more in conservation and increase their awareness around conservation elements, particularly, I guess, with regard to OECMs?
Sure. Well, I guess there are a couple of perspectives one can bring to that. The first is that those corporate lawyers may well be representing corporations who are owning large tracts of land. So the one way one can engage with that corporate legal set would be through one's negotiations in the context of individual land or individual parcels of land. The other perspective would be from a broader perspective. How does one ensure that the corporate mindset, the corporate legal mindset, is aware of these broader initiatives? But I think that's where the role of universities becomes crucial, through particularly engaging those particular corporate lawyers within post-qualification courses and so forth, or engaging them in the context of further postgraduate degrees, because many of those postgraduate degrees are engaging with these very issues around conservation and so forth. The corporate lawyers have a crucial role to play. And I was interested listening to Candace when she ended off, and I think, Christina, you highlighted it in the context of the incentives. This world in South Africa actually dates back that whole world of stewardship dates back to the early 2000s, when a couple of us were engaged in commenting on the very legislation which is now underpinning those different stewardship options, such as the Protected Areas Act and the Biodiversity Act. And at that particular time, corporate lawyers were engaged with a view to assisting thinking through the agreements which would underpin those different arrangements, and then working together with them, with the fiscal authorities, about trying to shape and form different incentives which could link through to those agreements, which were then linked through to the particular mechanisms contained in the statutory legal frameworks. So I think there are various ways one can engage with the corporate sector. The corporate legal sector is a crucial legal sector. So as I summarized, in their capacity as representing landowners, in their capacity as potential students in postgraduate degrees, and then in the context of thinking through implementation issues, engaging them in broader workshops, engaging them in broader steering committees and so forth, so that important constituency is part of the discussion.
Thank you, Sandy. Very important point. We also heard prior to the break from Dr. Madhurao about the interest in businesses and corporations to engage in conservation strategies or projects, primarily out of like a reputational benefit. Now, this is nice, but having actually a business case and a financial benefit coming out of it due to, for example, tax reductions or other financial incentives may get more corporate actors to see it worthwhile to align their business model with conservation strategies, and maybe also bring some more corporate lawyer on the track. I see. Oh, I saw a hand. Yeah, it's moving on my screen. Dr. Madhurao, if you want to join our discussion, please.
See, Christina, I just wanted to add that given a choice of engaging the chief executive of a corporate and the chief corporate lawyer, I will go for engaging the chief executive. The reason being, he runs, he owns, he understands the company. The lawyers work for the company. What we are trying to do in India now, we have an Indian Business and Biodiversity Initiative. 35 top corporates in the country have enrolled over there. And we hold meetings with them to say that why it is so important for the corporates to contribute in conservation. And I can say that this is paying good results. So we are now talking of the larger conservation, and slowly we want to introduce the OECM and other aspects of conservation as well. So I think our target should be the top bosses of the corporates, however we can get to them, and to explain to them that corporates and conservation, they go together. That is the message we want to put forward to them. And obviously in the process, the third communities will also come in. So corporates, conservation, and community. That will make the complete cycle of our initiative. Thank you.
Sorry. The mute button. Thank you, Dr. Madhurao, for your very important observations. And I completely agree with you that it is the big bosses convincing companies first, and that's usually the CEO. And then you perhaps also get the company lawyers on board, but it is the big bosses first, as you completely rightly highlighted. There's another question coming in the chat from William Dunbar. He asked what kind of tools would be useful for designating and making sure of monitoring of OECMs from legal or other perspective. I think this goes more to ensuring the effectiveness and ensuring the long-term benefits of OECMs, which is interesting because we've heard that in many contexts, OECMs are sort of building on initiatives that already exist and that can be defined as OECMs, but how do we ensure that they are effective, and how do we ensure the long-term benefits? Do any of the panelists have an answer or want to take this question?
I'm happy to take a first cut.
Absolutely. Please, Kathy.
I'm similarly, Christina. I'll follow Kathy.
Okay, Kathy and then Esme.
Look, this is a very good question. And I think I raised it in my presentation. I mean, how do we ensure that OECMs and protected areas continue to be effective? We do have some tools. We already have the green list standard, for instance, which can be applied to both protected areas and conserved areas. But I think increasingly we need to look at other models. It sounds as though Japan perhaps could do that through recertification of areas. Colombia raised this issue also of how are we going to continue monitoring these areas. But the beauty about OECMs is they have to prove that they're delivering effective biodiversity before they're even recognized. While I've got the floor, I also want to raise this issue that we want to avoid greenwashing everything we do for conservation and putting it all in the conservation bucket. Anything we can do for biodiversity right across the spectrum is good. But the GBF includes a lot of other elements and targets beyond target 3. And if we get even 30% of coverage into protected and OECMs, we will still need to have more sustainable management of the rest of the world. So that's another aspect, I think, of this legal discussion. What more can we do to make sure that existing legislation is already implemented and is even strengthened? So thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kathy. And I give the final word in this round of Q&As to Sandy, please.
Thanks, Christina. I think when one's talking, your question raised 2 points. This notion of the sustained long term, so sustained ongoing and long-term governance and management. That's the one component. And there are existing legal tools which can be used to achieve that through land trusts, covenants, servitudes, easements, restricting or prohibiting activities, and various other forms of contracts. So there are various tools which do exist, which can be used, but one has to tailor those very carefully to a particular context, because as I've previously indicated, and other speakers have previously indicated, one doesn't want to create hesitancy or aversion in the context of many communities and landowners where they suddenly see lawyers coming on board, which means that their rights and interests are going to be restricted. But I've been thinking a lot in the context of South Africa. So as Candice and Danielle's work points out, we have a very rigorous system at play in South Africa, which provides for this ability to identify these conservation areas. But the crucial thing is how do we measure their effectiveness? And at the moment, those mechanisms are scattered across many different laws. Some of them aren't even governed by particular legal frameworks, which makes me think, well, I'm just thinking through my particular context, is it necessary to potentially amend protected areas legislation? One could broaden its ambit, change its name, protected and conserved area legislation. I mean, that's the first thing I think we should start pushing to make sure that we're reflecting these two different types and these complementary types, but then embedding in that legislation some series of general criteria or some series of general reporting and monitoring requirements, because why those also become important in order to build the credibility of these areas and make sure that they are effectively fulfilling these definitional elements. It also links through to that other aspect, which I'm again going to refer to in the context of incentives, because often those incentives are held in the hands of the fiscus and held in the hands of the treasury, and the treasury want to see safeguards. The treasury or the fiscus want to see that there is effectiveness before they start sharing some of the money through various tax incentives, whether it's property tax incentives or income tax benefits. They want to ensure that there is some relevant safeguard to ensure that these areas are achieving those objectives. And I think that's where the law does have a potential role to play in creating some series of criteria, some series of standardized reporting and monitoring requirements. Otherwise, I think that avenue may be lost.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And the interesting thing is that, of course, the new GBF contains a very important monitoring and reporting requirement, and through the link maybe of OECMs to the national biodiversity strategy and action plans, there may be an enhanced transparency requirement and reporting requirement on them as well, which translates down to what needs to be done also in order to implement that on the domestic level. Dear colleagues, we are running a little late on the question and answer round, but I would like to thank every one of our panelists for their excellent interventions and also the engagement and discussion. I would like to recognize also Harry Jonah's contribution, who worked together with Kathy on the presentation for the WCPA. And with that, it is my great pleasure to give the floor over to Dr. Jolene Lin, the director of the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law. Jolene, you have the floor.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to give the closing remarks. And I feel that my role is really to briefly just, sorry, there's a bit of feedback. Can you mute yours? Sorry. No, I just wanted to, well, we're in a room together, so it's a little bit confusing. But first, I just wanted to thank Dr. Christina Voigt and Madhurao for inviting Asia Pacific Center of Environmental Law, as well as the Center of International Law, to participate and in partnership for putting together this webinar. It's been really, really interesting and enlightening to really have an opportunity to take a survey around the world on how various jurisdictions are implementing these OECMs. So I come to this area, and I basically listened with great interest, and also as a novice, looking at how at this area of law and how it's developed. And so my comments really come from an external perspective, but I also realized that Professor Patterson has already given such a wonderful bird's eye view and perspective, an external perspective of the legal issues that arise. I think what are the few things that struck me from listening to these presentations. First is that I think there's a lot of synergy to be pursued between OECMs and the broader quest to address the biodiversity crisis and the climate change crisis. It was mentioned a number of times that the OECMs are an important and an important nature-based climate change solution. And I would very much love to see how the community of lawyers and practitioners and scientists working on climate change could really foster cooperation with those working in OECMs and protected areas to really tackle these big crises of this century, especially when we think about the number of pledges that have been made to address deforestation, for example. Again, at COP26, which was just recently concluded in Glasgow in relation to the climate change, United Nations framework on climate change negotiations. Deforestation was once again put in the spotlight. And of course, OECMs would do a great deal in helping to tackle both deforestation as well as embedded deforestation. Some of the presentations also highlighted the need for funding. And I found it very interesting to think about how, when we talk about climate change, there's a lot of discussion about carbon credits, climate finance, and the ways to engage markets. How do we do that for biodiversity? Because ultimately we need to create viable, sustainable livelihoods for the communities who are going to be protecting and sustaining these OECMs, which are areas where they live, for example, or where they work, etc. I think another thing that really struck me was the notion that in many of the countries which are implementing OECMs, a lot of it will be relying on voluntary action by corporates. And I think, as a number of people have mentioned, that we need to ensure that this doesn't give rise to yet more greenwashing. there is, I guess from a legal perspective, there is a real concern about accountability and legitimacy, and therefore the importance of monitoring and transparency. In this regard, I think it would be really helpful to think about the importance of registries, public registries that are open to anybody, so that just like we expect non-state actors like NGOs and activists to monitor corporates on their climate pledges, should we not expect the same when it comes to their pledges to implement OECMs? I hear the conversation as a very interesting one, where you do not want the law or any legal framework to act as a stifling, rigid enforcer in an area that is really about cooperation and engagement with municipalities, regional governments, private actors, etc. But I do think that's also important to recognize that if we do not have adequate monitoring and transparency, we fall into a trap of all talk and no action, and that's something that is quite dangerous, especially when we're thinking about a 30 by 30 global target, and we have some way to go. And finally, I think it was just an opportunity to also think about how, if we look at all the presentations in this webinar, spanning from Japan to Bangladesh, India, Colombia, how amazing the array of unique socio-ecological environments that we have to protect. And I think it's really important to recognize that when we talk about OECMs, there are these unique landscapes, unique cultures and livelihoods that will be lost if we do not manage to do enough. And I guess finally, I would just end my comments by really thanking all the presenters for taking the time to join us for this webinar, especially at the end of a very challenging year, or yet another challenging year, where we have all been dealing with more virtual meetings. But at the same time, what has been very also encouraging is how through this platform, we're able to bring together all these voices to learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jolene, for your kind reflections and comments, very, very important points that you raise as well. But thank you also to APSEL and CIL at the National University of Singapore for cooperating with WCL and WCPA in this event. And I'll give the floor back to Madhu in a second, but I just want to thank everyone involved here today. It's been a very, very important first discussion. I go out with a feeling that there's so much more to explore, so much more to discuss, and I hope that we can continue this discourse in the next years, and hope to see many of you back. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise. It's highly appreciated. And I wish you all to stay safe and stay well. And I give the floor back to Madhu for her final remarks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christina. And just to say a very big thank you to the Center for International Law and the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law for so generously agreeing to support us for this webinar and for hosting this webinar, and to Alicia and her excellent team of support. Without them, we couldn't have achieved this wonderful webinar. Thank you all to the panelists, Dr. Vinod Mathur, Mr. Jahido, Mr. Haisa, Kathy and others, and of course, Sandy, and all the presenters who presented virtually. It was a very enriching discussion, and I think is the beginning of much more dialogue on this important interface between science and legal perspectives on OECMs. Thank you very much and have a good evening.